officer, start officer, training,
officer,
training, officer.
Yes, sir.
Officer,
Yes.
officer,
Any of his
scene,
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 do this,
sir, scene,
sir, area,
officer, area, officer,
Sir.
scene,
sir, scene, yes,
scene, is that
Yes.
right?
Sir.
Officer, or scene, officer,
It was better seeing officer area, scene,
officer, start, scene, officer, is that right?
scene,
Scene, public scene, officer, so scene, sergeant, do a scene, training, officer,
Training.
news, training, officer, training, officer, officer, start, officer, training,
officer,
training, officer,
yes, sir, yes, any of his
scene,
yes,
training, officer,
training, scene, officer, news, officer, training, officer, training, officer, training, scene, officer, training, scene, officer, training, training, scene,
training, officer,